Henry Louis Gates Jr. is here. Last February, he purchased a copy of a manuscript called The Bondwoman's Narrative by Hannah Crafts. According to Skip Gates, it is the first known novel written by an African-American woman who had been a slave. Gates, who edited the narrative of publication, is, as you know, the chairman of Harvard University's Afro-American Studies Department. I'm pleased to have him back at this table to talk about this rather remarkable discovery. Welcome back.
Thank you, Charlie. Nice to be back.
How did you find this? I mean, you had an auction? I mean, who got you tuned into this?
Well, actually, I was sitting in my favorite reading room in my house, and let's leave it at that. And I was reading a catalog. I had a disastrous series of hip replacement operations year 2000, 2001. 3 operations in 6 months. And I was on medical leave. I lost a year. I didn't write and do anything.
Infections and everything. I mean,
yeah, it was pretty bad. But there was a blessing.
Right.
And this was the blessing. The Swan Galleries in New York sponsors an annual February Black History Month auction of African Americana. All kind of memorabilia, slave chains, original documents, posters even. And every year I get their catalog. I'm on the mailing list because I'm a junkie for Afro-America and Afro-Americana.
Right.
And in this year's catalog, there was this listing that item number 30 said that there was a 301-page manuscript purportedly written by a black woman who claims to have been a female fugitive slave out of North Carolina. And I read this, and as I read further, it became even more intriguing. It was a novel about passing, and it had been taken from the collection of Dorothy Porter Wesley, one of the greatest black bibliophiles in the 20th century, second only to Arthur Schomburg, whose collection forms the basis of the New York Public up in Harlem.
So if it was in her collection,
that was serious.
That was serious.
That was serious. So I figured, why not? I would try to go for it. I was intrigued because, Charlie, we don't have, holograph manuscript means a handwritten manuscript. We don't have any handwritten manuscripts for any of the black writers in the belletristic tradition, meaning a book of poems, a novel, or a slave narrative, in the whole 19th century. Not Frederick Douglass, not Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, not William Wells Brown. So it would be extraordinarily rare if indeed one could authenticate her black identity. If not, if she turned out, once I bought the manuscript, to have been white, then it would be one of the first novels of passing. And that would be intriguing. So what did I have to lose?
Win-win.
So I asked Richard Newman, man who's on the staff of the Du Bois Institute, which, as you know, I have the pleasure of directing up at Harvard. And he went down, and he bid on my behalf. And I waited all day. I mean, I didn't have anything to do. I mean, the Supreme Court had taken away my fun of counting chads, right? By this time, that's how I filled up my day through the fall. Right. This is in February, so it was pretty boring, and I was losing my mind because I really wanted that manuscript. And Charlie, I thought the manuscript would go for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, because it was exceedingly rare. How rare is rare? How rare can rare be? There's only one.
Right.
There's only one. And,
but only a few people would know that.
Yeah, but they would all be at this auction.
Exactly. Every one of them would be there. Everybody who knew that would be there.
Actually, it probably was a blessing that I couldn't go because we all know each other. All these collectors, they would know me, and if I started bidding in the flesh, they would have bid the price up. Well, at the end of the day, the phone rang, and it was Dick Newman. And I said, Dick, you know, what happened? I guess we didn't get it. He said, oh, no, we got it. We were the only bidder. He said, I bid. I said, what'd you get it for? He said, $8,500 plus the commission. And I was so excited. So then the manuscript came, and it was bound, yellowing pages. The ink, which had been black, by this time had turned brown. And it was a first draft. It was a working manuscript, as we call it. She had all kind of strikeouts and paste overs, and it was the real thing. And so then I had to, by real thing I mean, it clearly was a very old manuscript. Then I had to proceed to authenticate it.
And how do you do that?
Well, the first thing that I did was to look in the 1850, 1860, 1870 censuses, looking for someone named Hannah Crafts. That's what she claimed her name to be. Well, there were, the manuscript, by the way, was bought in 1948 in New Jersey by a rare book dealer in New York City from what she called a traveling book scout. The novel ends in New Jersey, so New Jersey is a logical place. That's too much coincidence, so start looking in New Jersey. But in 1860, there was only one Hannah Crafts in New Jersey. And her name was Kraft, not Crafts, and she was a white woman living in Somerset, New Jersey. But when I looked in the 1850 census, she's not there. So all of a sudden, this woman shows up in 1860, which is about the time our dear Hannah Crafts would have escaped from the North. We also knew she was a mulatto because she disguises herself as a white male and escapes. So this could, I thought, have been a Hannah Crafts pretending to be white, passing for white,
right.
which would help to explain why she didn't publish her book, which would have outed her. Then I looked for, there were lots of other Hannah Crafts. As I say in my introduction, I found a black Hannah Crafts in the 1880 census living in Maryland, and my wife and my best friend Anthony Appia and I went out and we celebrated. I had a hangover 3 days later when I got the Xerox of the census form from the Mormon Family Library. It turns out she was indeed black, but she was born in 1850, and I knew by this time the book was written between 1855 and 1860, so unless she was Alberta Einstein, she hadn't written it. Right. But the even more damning fact was that she was illiterate.
So she was not a candidate.
We could not squeeze her in the realm of possibility.
So how long did it take you to authenticate it?
From February the 15th, when I bought it, through the summer. I finally finished the introduction in August.
Now, was there one confirming piece of evidence that said this is the real thing, this is
there were two. First off, I made a list of the proper names in the book. This was a long shot, because it's a novel. If you write a novel, if you're Jonathan Franzen, you don't go back to the St. Jude and go through the phone book and use real names, you get sued, right? You use fictional names. But she, being a first writer, an autodidact, and writing an autobiographical novel, she, as it turned out, had used real names. So, and she talks about Milton, Virginia, as the biggest city near the plantation where she lived in Virginia. So I went to starting in 1810, I went to all the censuses and compared the data in the censuses with the names, the proper names of the characters in the book, and all of the people, except for the Dickensian characters with names like Mr. Trapp and Mr. Sadler, they all lived where she said they lived.
So that was one piece of confirming evidence.
That was a big piece of evidence. Right. Because if this were written by an upper-class white woman in New York or Philadelphia or Boston, they would have used fictional names like Harriet Beecher Stowe did. Right. So that was really important. Secondly, though, was the discovery of the identity of Mr. Wheeler. The Mr. and Mrs. Wheeler were the most oppressive masters that she had, and they turned out to be very real indeed. John Hill Wheeler, who was minister of the American government to Nicaragua between 1854 and 1856, and the only man in America who owned property in both Washington, D.C. and North Carolina, just as she says in the book. That was her master. And John Hill Wheeler was famous. He was the most famous slaveholder in America for one brief year. In fact, 3 months in the summer and fall of 1855, because he had a slave named James Johnson. And he's on his way to Nicaragua from Washington. And to get to Nicaragua, you had to go to New York via Philadelphia and sail from New York down to Nicaragua. And he's taking Jane, his slave, and her 2 boys. And they stop at this hotel in Philadelphia for him to eat. She, of course, has to sit in the lobby. Now, Philadelphia is a hotbed of anti-slavery sentiment. And so he'd been warned, don't take this slave there because, you know, she might escape. People try to help her to escape. And he said, hogwash, because he's a very arrogant, very racist planter. And so he makes her sit in the lobby of the hotel while he goes to eat, and even tries to trick her. He sits down and then jumps up and runs to see if she's talking to any of the black people. The place is full of colored waiters, as he says. And he had warned her, don't talk to those colored waiters. And if they ask you if you are a slave, say no. Either say, no, I'm free, or say, no, I don't want to be free. And as soon as he sits down and his meal is served, Jane Johnson jumps up, runs over to a colored waiter and says, help me, I'm a slave, I'm a slave, I want to be free. And so they send a message to the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Office in Philadelphia. And William Still becomes very famous. He's the secretary of the organization, black man, who publishes a book in 1872 called The Underground Railroad, which among hundreds of other cases about slavery includes this case. He and a Quaker named Passmore Williamson run over to the hotel to help her to escape. By this time, Wheeler and she have gone to the boat heading to New York. They go onto the boat, they wrestle with Wheeler, and they help Jane to escape. Why is this important? It's important because when I read that case, and when I found out who Wheeler was, a friend of mine down at the University of North Carolina, Bill Andrews, the world's expert on slave narratives, said to me, do you realize that Wheeler was involved in the case of Passmore Williamson? So when I read that case and found out about Jane Johnson, I remembered a passage in this book. And the passage goes like this. Mrs. Wheeler comes to Virginia, visiting a plantation owned by a friend of hers. And Hannah Crafts is there, and she's looking for a slave. And she asked Hannah if she would do her hair. And Hannah's doing her hair, and she's very tender-headed, as black people say. She's tender-headed. And she said, "Oh, you're hurting my hair." And she says, "I haven't been able to get my hair done decently since Jane ran away to the north."
Jane Johnson.
And that Jane was Jane Johnson. That was my smoking pistol, man.
All right, what's this? Is it a literary masterpiece? Is it?
I wouldn't call it a literary masterpiece.
Okay, what would you
no.
call it?
I would say that it's the most sophisticated novel written by an African American before Charles Chesnutt at the turn of the century.
Really?
Yeah, it's
the most sophisticated.
Most sophisticated. It's gripping tale. Excuse me. It's the first novel written, as you said, by a female fugitive slave, and it's quite probably the first novel written by a black woman. Period. Right now, that distinction goes to Harriet Wilson, who published a novel called Our Nig in 1859 in Boston, but she was free. She was from the North.
Why was it never published? One, she feared that she might be discovered.
If, in fact, I'm not sure that she was passing for white. I think, you see, the novel ends with her living in an all-black community, married to a black Methodist minister, teaching school in New Jersey. And that's so unusual. Remember I said that the manuscript surfaced in New Jersey basically 100 years later. That's so unusual. No other slave narrative ends in New Jersey. So she probably was living in one of those all-black communities. There's 6 or 7 all-black communities. I just haven't found her. And one of the reasons I published the book at this point is to share all of my evidence.
Assuming people would give you everything they had.
Scholars, students, and genealogists. I'm getting emails every day from genealogists saying I'm wandering around in graveyards looking for headstones, and I think that's where she is. I don't think it was published because she was outside of the circuits of abolitionist authority. Most of the books published by black people were facilitated in one way or another by the abolitionists. Right. She was independent. And secondly, this book is very controversial. First of all, it's full of sex. I mean, by mid-19th century standards, it's XXX. Yeah. It's observations about white masters sleeping with their black female slaves, much more explicitly than any other. Secondly, and even more controversially, it is full of her observations about the class differences between house servants and field servants, as it were, lighter complected slaves and darker slaves. And though she's a snob, though she's not a racist, she certainly is a snob, and she believes that education and hard work are really good values. She's like a prototype of a black Republican in the middle of the 19th century. But she's adamantly opposed to slavery, and when Mrs. Wheeler attempts to force her basically to be complicitous in her own rape by a black field hand, whom she finds disgusting and foul-smelling, as she tells us in vivid language, that's when she decides to run away. And she runs away, but you see, in the book, she doesn't decide to pass for white. She bonds with other middle-class black people, and that's why I say she's not a racist, she's not color-struck, she's class-conscious. And that, we know, was very, very true within the slave community in the middle of the 19th century.
How much of it is novel and how much of it is nonfiction?
It's always a problem with autobiographical fiction, isn't it? Where does fact start, fiction stop?
Where does fiction stop and fact start?
Yeah, right. That's what I tried to say.
We understood. I mean, it's hard to determine, but do you have any sense of that? I mean, clearly part of this is autobiographical.
Imagine 2 parallel columns.
Right.
One would be facts from the novel. Right. One would be historical facts that I've been able to ascertain outside of the novel. In certain places, they're mirror images. In other places, we have no way to determine. As historical research proceeds, we will be able to determine more and more what was fact and what was fiction.
What do you most want to know about Hannah?
I want to know what happened to her.
Exactly.
You know, I want to find her in New Jersey, sitting at her kitchen table, writing this book. And that's the most frustrating thing. When I authenticated Harriet Wilson's identity, her racial identity, in 1982. And I found her. I mean, I could go to her house in Boston today. I knew exactly where she was. I knew where she was in New Hampshire, her second place of residence. But this woman just, it's like this table would open up and she just drops out of time. And the only thing that survived, Charlie, is her manuscript.
Okay, do you think that perhaps you discovered this one? Is this one of a kind, or maybe somewhere out there 5, 10, 15?
I think there are dozens more. And I would hope that just as
talk about this one,
the discovery of our Nig in 1982 basically led to this discovery 20 years later, I would think that this discovery would lead to other discoveries as well. And by the way, we've just put up a website bondwomansnarrative.com, so that people can contact us if they have any information, if they've discovered anything, any way to help us find this lost African-American fugitive slave.
Okay, who's come forward to say, I have something to contribute to this story?
Hundreds of people.
And what's the most important of that?
Well, very little of those generous overtures have yielded anything. People would say...
Well, has any of them yielded anything significant at all? Somebody who came back and said, now that you mention it, I know this, this, and this.
No. A scholar, a brilliant man who has, for the last 30 years, worked on John Hill Wheeler, contacted me after the Times story broke and said, would I mind sharing the manuscript? And I did it with great trepidation, and then he contacted me and said, whoever wrote this book knew John Hill Wheeler like the back of her hand, because this is his personality exactly.
So had to know him, see him, be part of his
so that was quite
slave holdings.
Absolutely. That was quite gratifying.
Whatever happened to him?
He was a government official in the 1860s, and he dies in the early 1870s. By the way, we found, we published one version in the book. We found his listing of all the books in his library. And so we know the books that she could have read while she was his slave. And then 2 weeks ago, we found a listing.
And are there references to them?
You see, I would hear echoes of books that she clearly had borrowed from or imitated. I didn't hear one important one, which is Charles Dickens' Bleak House, which it turns out she really used quite diligently, but or extensively.
You couldn't find any evidence of that in his...
No, he had 4 books by Dickens, yes, so he loved Dickens, so that's highly likely. But Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, Frederick Douglass's slave narrative, but this guy had a dozen slave narratives or abolitionist tracts in his library as well. So that when we hear echoes of Douglass, we know that she had access to Douglass's books through his library. And we put that catalog up on the bondwomansnarrative.com as well, so that people can begin to analyze who are literary influences. We've never been able to do that for a slave. We have not known what books they could have read.
What's interesting about this is, I mean, the story's just beginning almost. The discovery of the narrative could lead to other narratives, A and B. It could lead to a lot more information coming in as people begin to read the book and find out.
That's what I hope. You know, I published, I was the general editor of a series that Oxford published a few years ago called the Schomburg Library of 19th Century Black Women's Writers. And we collected in 40 volumes all of the known titles published by black women from Phyllis Wheatley up to the beginning of 1900. And we just brought that back into print as well. But now I think more and more books by blacks, period, and more especially by black women will emerge, and that's what I'm hoping.
What do we know about Dorothy Porter Wesley?
Oh, I knew her personally. She was a wonderful person. I dedicate the book to her.
This came from her collection?
It came from her collection.
Any other collections of narratives like this in her collection?
Not that I know of.
But wouldn't you know that?
I think I would. I think that they would have been put up for sale by the Swan Gallery. So I think that this was her only manuscript. You know what?
She bought it from Emily Driscoll.
1948 from that traveling book scout in New Jersey. But I think the biggest puzzle to me is why Dorothy didn't pursue it. But you see, it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to go through all of the manuscript sources for the census and all of these archives.
Why didn't Dorothy pursue it?
I don't know. I think because she had a full-time job as a librarian at Howard University. And I think that she just didn't have time to do it. And if I hadn't been confined to, if I hadn't been an invalid, basically, confined to home, recuperating from this surgery, I would have had time to do it. And you know who else helped me?
Who?
Librarians. I mean, I want to say this, and I give them all the credit in the book, but the Mormon Family Library, I called them and I said, look, I have a hunch, I bought this manuscript. The Mormons were so generous and so kind to me, I wouldn't have been able to...
You mean the Mormons in Salt Lake City?
In Salt Lake City.
You go out there and they'll trace anything for you. I mean, they are, is that what you're talking about?
I picked up the phone.
Amazing.
I told them that I had no hip. I was recuperating, and
hello, this is Skip Gates. I have one.
No hip. No hip. And they said I had one hip.
Yeah, right. I got tubes going into my body.
I did indeed have tubes going into my body, and I said, I don't want to be a pain. I'll be glad to pay you. And they refused to take any money. And I would call them and say, would you look up in the 1840 census the Henry family around Milton, Virginia? And they didn't analyze anything. They would just Xerox it and mail it back to me. And then I'd open it, tear it open. And eventually, Charlie, I had a room full of Xeroxes from different archives. Lisa Finder here in New York, a librarian at the Hunter College. Brian Cinch, a Will Andrews graduate student, using the UNC library, where Wheeler's papers are located. Esme Bond in Washington, another librarian who went to the Wheeler papers at the Library of Congress. these people helped me because I couldn't travel myself. So I was, I was at Command Central.
Poor little Skippy, we'll go help him.
It was very generous of them to do that.
You say this is more storytelling than chronicling.
That's right.
Meaning?
It's a fiction. It's clearly a novel. I mean, she writes about things that she could not possibly have seen or experienced, unlike, say, an autobiographical slave narrative such as Frederick Douglass's. You could draw a map of Douglass says, I was born in Tuckahoe, in Hillsborough.
Right.
Yeah, I was born in Hillsborough, in Tuckahoe County, et cetera, which is so many miles from this and so many miles from that. You could draw a map, verisimilitude, realism, painstaking realism. And the reason they used that mode of representation, of narration, was because all of these pro-slavery people said these slaves are all liars, or they couldn't have written their own books because they weren't intelligent enough. A.C.C. Thompson, Douglass's master's neighbor, wrote a letter in 1846 and said, I knew that Negro, and he was too dumb to have written this book. This book is too polished. Must have been written by some abolitionist. So all of the slave narrators had to establish their own authenticity. They had to establish their own capacity to write their books. So they were very realistic. This is fantastical. It's a blend of the sentimental and the Gothic, as well as slave narratives. So it's a true novel.
You left in all punctuation mistakes and things like that?
Everything. All of her cross-outs, all of her paste-overs, every grammatical spelling mistake that she made. I wanted it to be a real experience. In effect, the significance of this novel is that it's the first time that we have been able to encounter the unedited mind of a slave. Even Frederick Douglass had, even Frederick Douglass had some kind of editor, some kind of printer who would say, Fred, I think you split an infinitive here, or I think there's a dangling participle, but not this. This is exactly as she wrote it.
This is what Hannah Craft says. Those who think that the greatest evils of slavery are connected with physical suffering possess no just or rational ideas of human nature. The soul, the immortal soul, must ever long and yearn for 1,000 things inseparable to liberty.
Who but a slave would have written that? The book is full of counterintuitive observations about the effects that slavery has upon a slave.
It's the psychic damage, not the physical damage, that lasts.
That's it. She has another passage when she talks about the intimacy between a white mistress of the plantation and her black servant, her black female servant. And she says, readers in the North won't believe that this woman would tell me intimate details about her life, but that is the nature of the relationship. And you're a Southerner, you know. Southerners, white Southerners said for years, some in a positive way, some in a negative way, that the level of intimacy between whites and blacks in the South was much greater than the level of intimacy between whites and blacks in the North. And that, of course, I think historically was true.
Let's talk about you, now that we've talked about Hannah Crafts.
Oh, what could you possibly want to ask me about myself, Charlie?
Why would you leave Harvard? Was there damage done by the way Larry Summers, the new president, handled the relationship with Cornell and you?
No. Larry Summers has, first of all, he apologized to Cornell. He's over and over again expressed his deep support for the Department of Afro-American Studies at the Du Bois Institute and for the faculty individually and collectively. I'm absolutely convinced that Larry will be very, very supportive as president of anything academic that I'm interested in. So I would leave if I weren't convinced of that.
Right.
That would be, if I had a president or a dean who wasn't committed to diversity or to my field or was hostile toward it, that would be very, very difficult for me. I mean, I would fight him or her, but it would be very difficult to leave. It's not so much negative reasons, it's positive reasons. Going to Princeton, which appealed to me, being with that group of people and others, building again, being with my friends. Princeton's a very, very exciting place.
You have raised $40 million.
$40 million.
For the Institute at Harvard.
That's our endowment, right? Well, we'd go and, I guess, raise it again. But on the other hand, I really like Harvard. I'm very comfortable there. It's like you in New York. I mean, you seem to love New York. I love Boston. I love Cambridge. You know, it's just, I've taught at 4 places, and other than being an undergraduate at Yale in the late 60s and early 70s, and then being a junior faculty member between 76 and 85, I've never been at a place where I felt so comfortable. I felt so natural. And that's how I feel about Harvard. So I have a lot to think about. But it's not about anything negative about Larry Summers. I think Larry will be a great president. I think he's tough. He's hard-minded, very rigorous, and I happen to like that. I mean, you could tell him what you think, and you know, we argue and have a good laugh about it. I like that.
What do you want to do with your life?
When I grow up?
Yes. What is it you want to accomplish?
I'm still trying to figure that out. I know that in the next decade, you see, Charlie, now you've hit it. For me, the most important thing, more important than anything we've talked about, is how I want to spend the decade of my 50s. Okay, I'm 51 years old. When I'm 60, what I want to be able to look back and say I've accomplished. I've spent a lot of time in administration over the last 10 years. I'm really pleased with my role at the New Yorker, which, you know, I've been on medical leave basically. Now I'm back writing for the New Yorker again. But I want to write two scholarly works that I want to write. One was my PhD dissertation, which I want to now redo, on the role of black literature in the discourse of race in the Enlightenment in the 18th century. Okay? Then I want to do the history of African American literature, a book called The African American Canon, and a very detailed, close explication of the signal, the canonical text in the tradition. That's what I want to do. I want to continue to make documentaries for PBS, and you know, I hope this HBO thing works, and I want to do some things with him. But I like doing various things. I mean, I get bored easily. I like wearing lots of hats. But essentially, I'm a scholar. I'm a literary scholar at that, and I want to complete those two works and maybe a couple others.
This book is called The Bondwoman's Narrative, a novel by Hannah Crafts, edited by Henry Louis Gates, Jr., who I'm proud to call my friend, Skip Gates. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, my friend.
We'll see you next time.
That was great.